When my father told me I was incompetent and fired me from the family business, I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I simply nodded and walked out, holding the sting of his words in silence, because I had always known that love and approval can sometimes come wrapped in disappointment. And that day, as I stepped out of the polished office that had once felt like home, I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity: grief for the trust I had lost, clarity for the chance to define myself without him looking over my shoulder. And in the quiet of the car ride home, I kept repeating to myself that failure does not have to be permanent, that humiliation can be a teacher if you are willing to learn. And that very night, I sat alone in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about every moment I had spent trying to please him, trying to meet his impossible standards. And suddenly I realized that his words, harsh and cutting as they were, had freed me in a way I could not have imagined, because when someone you love and fear disapproves, it can either crush you or push you to rise in ways they never expected. And I chose to rise, not with anger, not with revenge yet, but with quiet determination to build something I could call my own, something that would not just succeed but flourish without his shadow. And in the weeks that followed, I began sketching plans late at night, small ideas on scraps of paper, imagining a business that could compete in the very industry he claimed I could never master. And as I wrote, I remembered every look of doubt he had given me, every sigh of disappointment, every word that made me feel small. And instead of breaking me, they became fuel, guiding every choice with careful attention. And I thought about my own skills, the small things I had learned from him, from my mother, from every person who had trusted me with work I once undervalued. And I realized that knowledge itself was my real inheritance, more than his money or his praise. And slowly, quietly, I started reaching out to old colleagues, people who had admired my work quietly, and I discovered that trust can be rebuilt when given space, that loyalty does not need to be demanded. It can be earned through consistency. And as months passed, I transformed my tiny apartment into a hub of ideas, papers, and strategies, with notebooks stacked like towers, calendars filled with timelines, and every day I woke up early, not with the weight of obligation but with purpose. And I began small, taking on projects no one else wanted, doing them carefully, proving myself quietly to clients who appreciated skill over family names. And in this slow, steady growth, I learned more about patience than I ever did sitting under my father's critical gaze, because each small success, each completed project, reinforced that competence is built, not granted. And as my confidence grew, I began imagining something larger, a company that could rival his. A company built not just on skills but on respect. And though the thought of competing with him made my heart tighten, it also brought a strange peace, because I was no longer seeking approval, I was seeking independence. And independence is more freeing than any applause. And late one night, as rain tapped softly against my window and the city lights reflected on wet streets, I looked at my scattered notes and whispered to myself that this was the start of a journey not defined by humiliation, but by the quiet, relentless drive to prove to myself, more than anyone else, that I could rise. And as sleep finally claimed me, I carried that resolve like a warm weight, ready for the slow, careful work that would one day turn the son he doubted into a rival he could not ignore. The first few months after leaving my father's office were harder than I expected, not because the work was difficult, but because the silence of starting alone felt heavier than any criticism he had ever thrown at me. And I often sat in my small apartment late at night, staring at spreadsheets and business plans, wondering if I had the courage to actually build something that could rival him. And yet, each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself that he had underestimated me once. And that alone was proof that the odds were not absolute. And I began with what I knew best, offering consultancy to small clients who valued my attention to detail. And slowly, steadily, my reputation began to grow, not through flashy marketing or loud claims, but through consistent quality, on-time delivery, and the quiet reliability that people sometimes forget to notice. And as I juggled clients, bills, and long nights of planning, I realized how much I had relied on him before, not just for guidance but for the unspoken authority his name carried. And now I had to rely entirely on myself, and that responsibility, though heavy, became strangely empowering. And during those long evenings, I sketched ideas for a company that could operate differently from his, one that valued people over hierarchy, innovation over tradition, and integrity over image. And the more I planned, the clearer it became that this company could not only exist but thrive if built carefully, thoughtfully, and without compromise. And as months turned into a year, I began recruiting a small team, people I trusted, people whose talents had been overlooked in their own careers, people who shared my vision of quiet, steady growth, and together, we built systems that were efficient, transparent, and adaptable, learning from every mistake and celebrating every small success without fanfare. And through it all, I never lost sight of why I had started. To prove to myself that competence is something you earn, and humility is something you can carry even while becoming powerful. And while my father continued to lead his company, oblivious to the quiet competitor growing outside his awareness, I studied his business carefully, noting patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities, not out of malice, but out of careful observation. Because to succeed against someone you respect and fear, you must understand them deeply. And one evening, as I reviewed financial reports and competitor analysis, I realized that the very decisions he thought were smart were often driven by ego, tradition, and impatience. And that gave me hope, not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because it proved that his empire was not untouchable. And with that realization, I focused harder, building partnerships, diversifying services, and gradually taking on clients that he had lost due to oversight or mismanagement. And each small victory, each client who chose to work with me over him, brought not gloating satisfaction, but quiet reassurance that my strategy was working, that patience, skill, and humility could achieve what arrogance and nepotism could not. And as I sat one rainy evening watching the city lights reflect on wet streets, I thought about how strange life is, how the same hands that were once scolded for incompetence were now shaping a company from scratch. And I felt a soft pride that had nothing to do with revenge, only with the joy of finally being trusted, both by others and by myself. And I knew that the next phase would be harder, that the real test was not creating a competitor but sustaining it, growing it enough to one day challenge his dominance. And I welcomed that challenge quietly, without hurry, knowing that every careful step now would set the stage for the ultimate transformation, a moment when the boy he had dismissed would stand as a professional equal, a moment that was inevitable not because of anger, not because of spite, but because of patience, skill, and the quiet determination to succeed on my own terms. And as I turned off the lights that night, notebooks stacked around me, pens scattered across the desk, I whispered to myself that this was only the beginning, and no one, not even my father, could take this journey away from me. By the second year, my small company had grown quietly but steadily, and it was during this time that I realized the power of observation, patience, and subtle strategy. Because while my father continued to run his business the same way he always had, making decisions quickly, trusting only long-time employees, and measuring success by appearances, I had built a team that was agile, careful, and motivated, and I could see the difference clearly in every interaction, every deal, every project completed on time. And one afternoon, as I reviewed our client list and project schedules, I noticed that a few of his clients, dissatisfied with delays and egos, were looking elsewhere, and the thought that my company could offer them exactly what they needed, quietly, efficiently, filled me with a calm determination, not to hurt him, but to show that competence and humility can coexist. And in those months, I began approaching these clients carefully, understanding their needs, listening more than I spoke, and offering solutions without pride or pretense. And one by one, they began to trust me, not because I was his son, not because of my name, but because of reliability, honesty, and skill. And each contract we secured felt like a small, silent triumph, a step toward proving not to him, but to myself, that I was capable of building something meaningful, sustainable, and respected. And as I juggled more responsibilities, I also began analyzing his business more deeply, not out of revenge, but because understanding his strengths and weaknesses could guide my own growth. And it became clear that while he excelled in relationships that reinforced his ego, he often ignored operational flaws, small inefficiencies that, when corrected, could turn his clients away. And I realized that the power of observation is often stronger than the power of authority, because it allows you to act where others are blind. And late one evening, while reviewing a long report on a key client he had mishandled, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in his failure, but in the fact that I could finally step in and offer value where he had overlooked it. And in those moments, I began to understand a truth I had never fully grasped before. Revenge is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is consistent, patient, and disciplined action that quietly shifts power over time. And over the next few months, my company took on larger projects, handled more complex clients, and began to draw attention in industry circles. Not with flashy announcements, but with consistent performance and satisfied feedback. And the more we succeeded, the more I felt the weight of the early humiliation fade, replaced with quiet confidence, because every deal closed, every project delivered on time, was proof of competence that no words could erase. And during this period, my father began noticing our presence. First with a raised eyebrow, then with questions to colleagues, subtle inquiries that hinted he had realized a competitor was emerging. And while part of me felt a small thrill at this recognition, I reminded myself that my work was not about proving him wrong in public, but about establishing independence. And independence, I realized, is far more satisfying than approval, because it cannot be taken away by words or pride. And as our team grew, I also began mentoring younger employees personally, teaching them not just technical skills, but also how to carry themselves with patience, humility, and confidence. Because I knew that success is not only about projects and profits, but about the people who make those outcomes possible. And each time one of them thanked me for guidance, I felt a quiet warmth that eclipsed any satisfaction from winning a contract. And around this time, a major turning point occurred, when one of his largest clients, frustrated by repeated delays and poor communication, quietly reached out to me, not expecting much but hoping for a solution. And after a careful meeting, I offered a tailored plan, scheduled milestones, and clear communication channels, and they accepted, not because I had tried to show superiority, but because I had listened, understood, and acted. And that day, when the deal was finalized, I sat alone in my office and allowed myself a small smile, because this was the first time I had directly won a client from him, not through luck but through diligence, strategy, and care. And I understood that the real victory was not in their decision, but in the method, the quiet consistency that made it inevitable. And as weeks passed, more clients followed, drawn by reliability and service. And my father, who had once dismissed me as incompetent, began asking his colleagues why he was losing business. Noticing a competitor who seemed almost invisible, yet increasingly powerful. And I watched this unfold without gloating, because the goal was never public humiliation, only building something that could stand on its own. And as our reputation grew, so did our influence, and I began being invited to industry discussions, small conferences, and advisory panels. And each time, I felt the same quiet pride, because I was recognized not for my family name, but for skill, insight, and integrity. And one evening, sitting in my office late after reviewing financial projections, I thought about the irony of life, that the very man who had called me incompetent was now noticing a business built from my hands. And yet I felt no anger, no rush for revenge, only a deep sense of satisfaction and validation, because true success is measured in competence, consistency, and self-respect, not in applause. And as months turned into a second year of active competition, I began to plan carefully for the next phase, not rashly, not dramatically, but with strategy, observing his company, noting patterns, identifying gaps, and preparing a plan that would gradually allow my company to match his scale, influence, and prestige. And I reminded myself daily that this was not about payback, but about proving to myself that being dismissed as a failure does not define the rest of your life. And one rainy evening, as I closed my laptop and watched water run down the windowpane, I reflected on the transformation, from a young man humiliated, dismissed, and underestimated, to a founder building a rival company quietly yet effectively. And I felt an unusual calm, because I knew that every late night, every careful step, every patient choice, had been preparing me for a moment of impact that would not need to shout, only to exist, to grow, and to shine steadily. And as I turned off the lights and looked around my small office, filled with notes, plans, and the hum of possibility, I whispered to myself that this was only the beginning, that patience, humility, and skill were more powerful than pride, and that the real challenge was still ahead. To face my father, not with anger or vengeance, but with the quiet force of a man who had built something greater than anyone thought possible. And knowing that, I finally slept that night with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with self-respect. And the next chapter of this journey was ready to unfold. By the beginning of the third year, my company had gained a noticeable presence in the market, though it was still smaller than my father's empire. I had learned the value of quiet growth, of steady, careful work, and I watched from the sidelines as my father continued his usual pattern, making decisions quickly, sometimes impulsively, trusting those who reinforced his ego rather than those who quietly added value. One afternoon, a major opportunity appeared. An important client he had handled poorly, a client who needed attention, reliability, and someone who could truly understand their needs. I knew this was the moment to act, but I also knew that rushing in recklessly could destroy the fragile trust I had built. So I planned carefully, analyzing every detail of their operations, creating proposals that were clear, actionable, and realistic, and scheduling meetings at times convenient for them, showing respect for their time and their business. And slowly, without fanfare, they began to trust me. The first time they openly discussed transferring a portion of their business to us, I felt a quiet thrill that had nothing to do with pride, only confirmation that careful, patient work yields results. At the same time, I continued to study my father's company, noting patterns, weaknesses, and areas where his leadership was rigid, where he failed to adapt to small but significant changes in the market, and I realized that his empire was not invincible. It was vulnerable to strategy, patience, and careful execution. Over the next several months, we gradually began taking on more clients, handling more complex projects, and delivering consistently where he had stumbled. Each successful project strengthened our reputation, and though my father was aware of our growing presence, he dismissed it at first as temporary, as something that could not last, because in his mind, legacy and authority were more important than adaptability and care. I watched this unfold with a calm mind, reminding myself that my goal was not humiliation but independence, and that independence is far more satisfying than approval or revenge. One afternoon, a longtime client of his, frustrated by repeated errors and delays, scheduled a private meeting with me quietly without informing him. We discussed solutions, timelines, and a careful plan of action. By the end of the meeting, they were ready to partially transfer their projects, trusting us over him, not because we were bigger, not because we had influence, but because we had earned their confidence with steady competence and thoughtful care. That day, sitting in my office surrounded by notes and projections, I allowed myself a small smile. This was the first time my work directly impacted his business in a measurable way, and I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with vengeance, only with demonstrating that skill and patience are more powerful than arrogance and entitlement. Weeks passed, and slowly, our client base continued to grow. Our reputation for reliability and careful execution began attracting attention in industry circles, not through advertisements or press releases, but through word of mouth and the satisfaction of those who had experienced our work firsthand. During this time, I also focused on mentoring my team personally, teaching them not just technical skills, but how to carry themselves with patience, humility, and confidence, because I knew that a strong team is the backbone of any lasting business, and their growth mirrored my own, reinforcing that investing in people brings lasting impact beyond contracts and profits. One evening, after reviewing financial reports, I noticed that our growth had reached a tipping point. The number of clients moving toward us was now significant enough that my father could no longer ignore it. His colleagues, those who had long worked under him, began asking questions in private meetings, subtle hints that he was beginning to notice the competitor emerging quietly in the shadows. And while a small part of me felt a thrill, I reminded myself that this was not about pride or revenge. It was about establishing independence and proving to myself that I could succeed without his approval. Later that week, during a routine industry conference, I unexpectedly met him in the hallway. There was no confrontation, no anger, only a brief exchange of polite words. He asked about a particular client, and I answered carefully, factually, without arrogance. And he nodded, slightly uneasy, a flicker of recognition in his eyes that I had grown beyond the son he once dismissed. Walking away from that meeting, I realized the irony. The very man who had once fired me for incompetence was now indirectly acknowledging my competence through subtle questions and guarded curiosity. That evening, I returned to my office and reflected on the transformation of the past 3 years, from being humiliated and dismissed to quietly building a company that could rival his, step by step, without drama, without shouting, only through patience, careful strategy, and relentless focus on competence. I understood something important in that moment. Revenge does not have to be loud, and victory does not need to be visible. The real power lies in quiet consistency, in demonstrating skill where others expect failure, in allowing your actions to speak louder than words. As months turned into the next year, my team continued to grow, and our influence became more tangible. We began attracting high-value clients, expanding into areas my father's company had neglected, and innovating in ways he was slow to adopt. And while he occasionally asked his colleagues why certain clients had shifted, he still underestimated the methodical, patient approach I had taken, and that was precisely the advantage I needed. One rainy evening, sitting in my office surrounded by notes, plans, and financial reports, I thought about how far I had come. The boy who had been dismissed for incompetence was now leading a team, managing clients, and quietly influencing an industry. The humiliation I had carried for years had been transformed into fuel for measured, strategic action, and I felt a sense of calm satisfaction, not because I had finally beaten my father, but because I had proven to myself that my own abilities and persistence could create something lasting and meaningful. That night, as the rain tapped softly against the window and the city lights reflected on wet streets, I realized the true lesson. Being underestimated is a gift in disguise, because it forces you to build carefully, think deeply, and act consistently. I understood that the quiet victories, the ones no one sees until they are undeniable, are far more powerful than public acclaim, and in that moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of accomplishment, independence, competence, and the beginnings of influence that my father had never anticipated. I knew the next stage would be the hardest, the phase where our growing company would challenge his directly, but I welcomed it, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with calm focus and steady determination, because every careful choice I had made over the past 3 years had prepared me for this moment, and I understood that true power comes not from shouting or forcing recognition, but from quietly building something that cannot be ignored, cannot be denied, and cannot be dismissed. And as I closed my laptop and looked around my office, the hum of possibility filling the quiet space, I whispered to myself that this was the turning point, not of his downfall, but of my own emergence, and that the best chapters of this story were still ahead, waiting to unfold with patience, skill, and quiet resilience. By the 4th year, the growth of my company had become undeniable. What had started as small projects and careful client management had transformed into a steadily expanding business that was beginning to rival my father's enterprise. I remember sitting in my office one quiet afternoon, sipping tea and reviewing financial statements, feeling a calm sense of pride that had nothing to do with gloating and everything to do with quiet validation. Every late night, every small decision, every cautious step had led to this point. We had secured clients who had long been loyal to him, not because we forced them, but because we consistently delivered reliability and results where his company had faltered. It was strange to realize that the same people who had once questioned my competence now sought guidance, partnership, and solutions from me, and though I had never intended this journey to be about revenge, I could not deny the satisfaction in seeing the tables turn so naturally, so quietly. As our reputation grew, I continued to focus on the core principles that had brought us this far: patience, skill, and integrity. I mentored my team personally, emphasizing collaboration, listening, and careful planning, because I knew that the strength of a company is only as strong as the people who run it. And in those months, I also learned something new about leadership. Quiet influence often outlasts loud authority. Meanwhile, my father began noticing the shift. At first, it was subtle, passing questions to colleagues, brief mentions in meetings, a raised eyebrow here and there. But soon, the signs became clearer. I could sense that he felt the change in the air, though he did not yet understand the source. He continued to run his company with the same patterns, the same reliance on his ego and traditional practices, unaware that the foundation of his dominance was slowly being challenged by someone he had dismissed as incompetent. One day, an old mutual contact approached me with an interesting proposal. They had observed the trend of clients moving toward us and suggested a partnership or merger discussion. While the idea was tempting, I refused. I wanted no shortcuts, no rushed victories. My goal was not merely to surpass him, but to prove that a carefully built company could thrive on its own. I accepted smaller partnerships selectively, those that aligned with our values, and each one reinforced the strength of our network. Over the next several months, our influence expanded further. We introduced innovative services, streamlined processes, and focused on client satisfaction in ways his company had long ignored. Clients appreciated transparency, responsiveness, and honesty, and they referred others quietly, steadily building our reach. I remember walking through the office one evening, listening to my team collaborate, sharing ideas, troubleshooting problems, and I felt a deep sense of connection and fulfillment. The work no longer felt like proving something to my father. It felt like creating a space where competence, integrity, and care mattered more than hierarchy, tradition, or ego. And then, the first direct challenge came. A high-profile project, one that my father had been managing personally, experienced delays and miscommunications. The client reached out to us, not seeking to undermine him, but hoping we could provide solutions. I prepared meticulously, offering detailed plans, timelines, and clear communication, and when the project was handed over, we executed flawlessly. The client's satisfaction spread quietly through the industry, and suddenly, our company was recognized not just as an upstart, but as a serious competitor capable of handling projects that had once seemed untouchable. I received a brief call from my father that week, asking about the project, but I answered calmly, factually, without pride or accusation, and I could hear the subtle shift in his tone, a mixture of surprise and guarded respect. It was the first time I sensed he truly recognized my competence. That evening, as rain fell gently outside my window, I reflected on the journey from humiliation to this quiet triumph. Being fired had been the catalyst, the moment that forced me to step outside his shadow and build my own path. And now, 4 years later, the work I had poured into this company was beginning to bear fruit, not as revenge, but as evidence that perseverance, humility, and skill can achieve results that ego and authority alone cannot. As our company expanded, I also began preparing for the inevitable day when we would compete directly on the same scale. I studied his patterns, his strengths, and his weaknesses, not to exploit them maliciously, but to understand the dynamics of leadership and decision-making at that level. I refined our strategies, strengthened our team, and built resilience into every part of the company, knowing that patience and preparation would always outweigh haste and arrogance. And during this time, I experienced something unexpected, a sense of peace. The humiliation I had carried for years had been transformed into discipline, focus, and purpose. Every choice I made now was informed by what I had learned from failure, and each decision brought clarity rather than fear. I realized that the power of quiet action is often underestimated, that consistent effort, careful observation, and thoughtful strategy can change outcomes without drama or confrontation. Months passed, and our influence continued to grow. More clients moved toward us, drawn by consistency, transparency, and efficiency, and each success, though quietly achieved, strengthened my confidence in our approach. I began to see patterns in my father's company that had been invisible before, patterns of complacency, over-reliance on tradition, and resistance to change. And I knew that the moment of direct challenge would arrive naturally, without rush, without force, because preparation and patience make opportunity inevitable. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing plans for the next quarter, I realized how far we had come, from a small apartment, late nights, and whispered doubts, to a company capable of competing on equal footing with the very man who had once fired me for incompetence. And in that quiet moment, I understood the true lesson. Success built on patience, skill, and integrity is far more powerful than any revenge born of anger. The first direct impact on my father's business had been achieved not through confrontation, but through careful preparation, competence, and the quiet accumulation of trust and respect. I knew the journey ahead would be challenging, that the final stage of rivalry would demand focus, resilience, and strategic planning, but I was ready. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for the culmination of years of steady work, discipline, and quiet growth. And as I looked out at the city lights reflecting on wet streets, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I had transformed humiliation into opportunity, dismissal into strategy, and criticism into motivation. The boy once labeled incompetent was now a man building a rival empire with care, patience, and quiet determination. And I understood that the true victory would not be measured in noise, applause, or public acknowledgement, but in competence, self-respect, and the ability to influence outcomes without needing to boast. That night, as I closed my laptop and listened to the rain tapping softly against the window, I whispered to myself that this was only the beginning of the final act, the stage where preparation meets opportunity, where years of careful work confront the complacency of authority, and where the quiet, patient effort of one man could, at last, reshape the balance of power. And with that thought, I allowed myself to rest, knowing that the coming months would test everything I had built, but that I was ready, grounded, and confident in the slow, steady power of competence and careful action. By the fifth year, the shift had become unmistakable. My company was no longer a quiet competitor. We had become a force that clients, colleagues, and even my father's employees had to take seriously. It was subtle at first, smaller clients moving our way, a few influential people recommending us, but soon the impact grew more visible. One morning, I received an email from a longtime client of his, asking if we could take over an entire project because they had lost patience with delays and miscommunication. I read the message quietly, without excitement, because I had learned that calm reflection produces better decisions than impulsive emotion. I replied carefully, outlining a plan that was thorough, transparent, and realistic, and within days the contract was ours. I didn't gloat. I simply noted it in our records and briefed my team. This was the first time I had directly taken business from my father, and while it felt significant, it also felt natural, the result of years of preparation, patience, and consistency. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Clients who had once relied solely on his company were quietly shifting toward us, drawn by reliability and care. I tracked these moves meticulously, not out of obsession, but to understand the dynamics of influence, and I realized that the foundation of success lies not in ego, but in competence that others can trust. My father began to notice, more openly this time, asking his colleagues why certain projects had changed hands. I heard whispers in industry circles, small murmurs that his leadership was being challenged, and I understood that our influence was growing faster than even I had anticipated. I didn't let this inflate my pride. I reminded myself that the goal was not to destroy him, but to create a company that could thrive independently, and if that also changed the balance of power, it would be a natural consequence, not a purpose. One afternoon, I received a call from him directly. His voice was calm but cautious. He asked about a client we had recently acquired, neutral, almost measured, but with a hint of underlying tension. I answered factually, carefully, without pride or confrontation, and he thanked me, then ended the call. I could sense the unease beneath his composed tone, and for a brief moment I understood the irony. The same man who had fired me for incompetence was now seeking information from the very company I had built. That evening, I reflected on the years that had led to this moment. From the humiliation of being dismissed, the small apartment nights filled with planning, to the slow, steady accumulation of trust and competence, everything had prepared me for this stage. I realized that the path to influence is gradual, built on consistency, skill, and careful attention to detail. Later that week, a larger project arose, one that my father had been negotiating for months, but had delayed due to internal miscommunication. I analyzed every aspect, prepared an innovative plan, and presented it directly to the client. They were impressed with our clarity, responsiveness, and realistic approach, and within days the project was ours. This was a turning point. The work we had done silently, steadily, had now begun to reshape the perception of leadership in our industry. My father's authority was no longer unquestioned. Competence had taken its place. In the months that followed, our momentum accelerated. We expanded our team, added specialized services, and strengthened partnerships. Employees who had once been loyal to him began reaching out to explore opportunities with us, not because they wished to betray him, but because they saw the value in working with a company that respected skill, effort, and integrity. I watched this unfold quietly, without celebrating publicly, because I had learned that subtle influence is stronger than dramatic gestures. One evening, I received a message from one of his top managers, indirectly acknowledging that our company had surpassed expectations and was a serious competitor. I felt a calm satisfaction, not from the implication of superiority, but from knowing that our work had spoken louder than words, that our quiet approach had reshaped the balance of influence. Around this time, I also reflected on my own growth. The boy who had once been fired for incompetence had evolved into a leader capable of shaping projects, guiding teams, and influencing industry standards, all without losing the humility and patience that had brought him here. I began preparing for the next challenge, the final phase where we would compete not just in clients, but in leadership and reputation. I studied my father's business closely, noting vulnerabilities and inefficiencies, and began devising strategies that would allow us to offer superior solutions without creating public conflict or drama. Each plan was carefully thought out, every risk calculated. I reminded myself that power grows quietly, not through confrontation, but through consistent, reliable action. Weeks later, a major client requested a full review of their contracts, considering switching entirely to our company. I coordinated meetings, prepared detailed reports, and presented clear, actionable solutions. The client agreed, and our influence expanded further. My father noticed more openly now. He called colleagues to ask questions, subtle signs of concern, but I maintained the same calm approach. I understood that demonstrating competence, not seeking revenge, would create results far more lasting than any emotional confrontation. One rainy evening, after finalizing another major client acquisition, I sat alone in my office, the quiet sound of rain tapping against the window, reflecting on the journey. From humiliation to steady growth, from rejection to influence, I had learned that the real measure of success is not public acknowledgement, but competence, patience, and the ability to build something sustainable. I thought about my father, not with anger but with clarity. His dismissal had been painful, yes, but it had forced me to rise, to think independently, and to act consistently. The company I had built was stronger than any reactionary decision. It was the product of years of careful work, strategic observation, and relentless focus on skill and integrity. That night, as I closed my laptop and listened to the rain, I felt a deep sense of calm. The coming months would bring the final confrontation, where our growth and his complacency would collide. I was ready. Not for revenge, not for public victory, but for the culmination of years of patience, discipline, and careful, strategic action. The boy once labeled incompetent was now a man quietly reshaping the balance of power. And in that quiet realization, I understood the most important lesson. True strength is built slowly, in silence, through consistency and integrity, and when the time comes, it does not need to shout to be undeniable. By the 6th year, the impact of our company was impossible to ignore. What had once been quiet, subtle growth had turned into a steady wave, touching clients, employees, and industry peers alike. My father began to notice openly, asking questions in meetings, reviewing projects more closely, and sending his managers to inquire indirectly about our operations. It was the first time I felt the direct effect of our years of patient work, and I did not feel triumph or gloating, only a calm understanding that preparation and consistency had brought us to this stage. One morning, a high-profile client contacted us directly, bypassing my father entirely. They were frustrated with delays, lack of communication, and unfulfilled promises. I listened carefully to their concerns, validated their frustrations, and outlined a clear, realistic plan to address every issue. Within days, the contract was ours. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not because I had won over my father's client, but because I had built a system capable of delivering excellence where others had failed. As the weeks passed, more clients began shifting toward us. Employees from his company, noticing our structured processes and respectful environment, quietly expressed interest in joining us. I welcomed them carefully, ensuring that our growth was sustainable and aligned with our values, and I continued mentoring my team, teaching them that patience, humility, and skill are the foundations of lasting success. Around this time, my father scheduled a private meeting with me under the guise of discussing industry trends. I knew the real reason. He wanted to gauge my company's progress firsthand. When we met, he spoke cautiously, asking about a client we had acquired and subtly probing our operations. I answered with calm clarity, factually and without pride, and I could sense his unease. The same man who had once dismissed me as incompetent was now seeking insight, quietly acknowledging that the boy he had underestimated had grown into a formidable competitor. Over the next few months, our growth accelerated further. Large contracts, previously thought untouchable, were transferred to our company due to our reputation for reliability and transparency. My father tried to adapt, implementing changes in his operations, but he was too slow. Habits rooted in years of authority, reliance on ego, and resistance to change slowed his responses, while we moved decisively, carefully, and with foresight. I watched this unfold with a sense of quiet responsibility. I reminded myself constantly that this was not about revenge, but about demonstrating that competence, consistency, and integrity could outperform arrogance and complacency. One evening, after a particularly successful project completion, I received a call from one of my father's senior managers. acknowledging our superior execution and efficiency. I felt calm satisfaction, knowing that our work spoke louder than words, and I realized that true influence is earned, not demanded. Around this time, I began considering the final stage of our strategy. My company had reached a level where we could directly challenge my father's dominance in the industry. It was not a move driven by anger or revenge, but by careful planning, observation, and preparation. I studied his company meticulously, noting operational weaknesses, inefficiencies, and areas where he relied too heavily on tradition and authority rather than adaptability and skill. I also focused on strengthening our internal processes, ensuring that our teams were prepared for larger projects, faster decision-making, and high-level client demands. The tipping point came when one of his largest clients expressed serious dissatisfaction, citing repeated delays and poor communication. They reached out to us, not to hurt him, but because they needed reliability and solutions. I prepared carefully, presenting a structured plan, realistic timelines, and clear accountability. Within weeks, the client agreed to transfer their projects to our company. I remember sitting in my office that evening, watching the rain streak down the window, feeling the weight of what had been achieved. This was the first instance where our growth directly challenged my father's authority and influence, and yet I felt no gloating. The satisfaction was quiet, reflective, and rooted in the validation of years of effort, patience, and careful planning. In the following months, the pattern continued. More clients shifted toward us, impressed by consistent delivery, transparent communication, and genuine care. Employees from his company, recognizing the opportunity to grow in a healthier environment, joined us quietly. Industry peers began noticing our rise, though we did not advertise it loudly. The quiet strength of our company had begun to reshape perceptions and balance of power. My father's reactions grew more noticeable. He called meetings to address lost clients, questioned his managers, and even attempted to implement quick-fix strategies. But he had underestimated the cumulative effect of years of preparation, consistency, and strategic thinking. Our company was not just reactive, it was proactive, structured, and adaptable. One afternoon, he requested a direct meeting with me, no intermediaries, under the guise of discussion and collaboration. I prepared carefully, anticipating his concerns, and approached the meeting calmly. The conversation was polite, factual, and carefully measured. I answered his questions without pride or accusation, and he left with a subtle acknowledgement of my competence, though pride and ego prevented him from saying it aloud. That night, I reflected on how far we had come, from humiliation, dismissal, and self-doubt to building a company capable of rivaling my father's. Every step had been deliberate, patient, and strategic. I understood that the true power of influence is built quietly, through competence, consistency, and integrity, and that public recognition, while satisfying, is not necessary for meaningful success. By the end of the year, our company had secured multiple high-profile clients, expanded our services, and established a reputation for reliability and professionalism. My father's company, while still large, was beginning to feel the tangible impact of our growth. He had been forced to acknowledge, silently if not publicly, that the boy he once fired for incompetence was now a formidable competitor. I felt no malice, only calm reflection and satisfaction. The journey had transformed me, not just as a businessman but as a person. I had learned patience, strategic thinking, humility, and the quiet strength that comes from consistent effort. That night, as I sat in my office listening to the gentle hum of the city and the soft tapping of rain against the window, I understood the ultimate lesson. True success is not loud. It is not about revenge, and it is not about public validation. It is built quietly, patiently, through skill, consistency, and integrity, and when the time comes, it becomes undeniable. The stage was set for the final act, where years of careful preparation, subtle strategy, and unwavering focus would culminate in a shift that no one could ignore, not through force or confrontation, but through the undeniable power of quiet, sustained competence. And with that calm reflection, I allowed myself to rest, knowing that the coming months would mark the moment when the boy once dismissed for incompetence would finally stand as an equal, not through pride or vengeance, but through years of quiet, relentless dedication. By the 7th year, our company's presence in the industry had become impossible to ignore. What had begun as a quiet, cautious effort to prove my own competence had grown into a fully operational, respected business, capable of handling projects my father's company once dominated. The shift was gradual but steady, and I could see the subtle signs in every corner of the market. Clients quietly preferring our services, employees leaving his firm to join us, and colleagues remarking on the quality of our work without ever knowing the backstory. One afternoon, a major opportunity arrived. A client who had been loyal to him for years, frustrated by delays and poor communication, reached out to us directly. I reviewed the situation carefully, preparing a detailed plan, and scheduled a meeting to present solutions tailored precisely to their needs. I made no attempts to undermine him publicly. I simply focused on competence, reliability, and clarity. The client agreed to transfer their project. It was the first time we directly overtook a high-profile client, and while it felt significant, I kept my emotions calm, knowing that this moment was the product of years of preparation and quiet strategy. Around the same time, I noticed subtle changes in my father. He had always been quick to anger in private, but now I sensed something deeper: unease. He asked questions in meetings, checked reports more frequently, and occasionally his managers approached me indirectly, curious about our processes. I did not gloat. I understood that his awareness was confirmation of our impact, not an invitation for revenge. Over the next few months, our growth accelerated. More clients moved to us, impressed by responsiveness and consistent delivery. Our team expanded, incorporating talented individuals who valued integrity and careful planning. Each success was quiet but profound, a testament to the power of patience and skill over arrogance and complacency. One evening, a client approached us with a large-scale project that my father had been negotiating for months, but had mishandled due to internal inefficiencies. I coordinated with my team, devised a strategic plan, and executed it flawlessly. The client's satisfaction spread quietly, influencing others in the industry, and I realized the full weight of what we had accomplished. A company built from the ground up, capable of outperforming a long-established empire not through force, but through steady, thoughtful action. My father noticed more openly now. He called meetings, asked questions, and attempted adjustments, but the patterns of his company, rigidity, reliance on ego, and slow adaptation, prevented quick recovery. I continued to act carefully, never celebrating victories publicly, knowing that real influence is silent until it cannot be ignored. Then came a pivotal moment, a key industry event where both our companies were presenting to potential clients. My father expected a display of confrontation, but I approached it differently. I focused on competence, clarity, and the demonstration of skill through meaningful presentations. Our projects were highlighted through real results, client satisfaction, and efficiency metrics. The contrast was subtle but unmistakable. Industry observers began commenting quietly on our approach, noting how effectively we managed projects and communicated with clients. I watched from the audience as he realized, without words, that the boy he had once dismissed was now a peer in every sense that mattered. The following week, a significant client fully transferred their account to us. It was undeniable. Our company had overtaken a major segment of his business. I did not call him or gloat. I simply noted the achievement and continued planning the next steps. Quietly, strategically, we were shifting the balance of influence. In the months that followed, I continued to strengthen our internal systems, ensuring we could sustain and grow without depending on luck or circumstance. Employees who had once worked under him began expressing admiration for our management style, and several joined us, not out of spite, but because they recognized an environment that valued skill, reliability, and integrity. My father attempted adjustments, but his responses were always reactive, rarely proactive. The contrast between our approach and his methods was becoming clear, and it was now visible not only to employees and clients, but also to peers in the industry. One rainy evening, as I sat alone in the office reviewing reports, I reflected on the journey. The boy fired for incompetence had transformed into a man whose work, patience, and strategic thinking had created a company that could rival a long-standing empire. Every late night, every careful step, and every lesson learned from earlier humiliation had contributed to this moment. I understood fully now. True power is quiet, consistent, and patient. Public recognition is fleeting. Competence and integrity endure. Then came the twist I had anticipated for years. A board member of his company reached out to me privately, explaining that they were considering restructuring and seeking investment to stabilize operations. They had observed our growth and believed that a partnership, or at the very least, my involvement, could secure their future. I listened carefully, considering the implications. This was the moment where years of preparation, careful observation, and quiet growth converged. I could have approached it recklessly, but instead I chose strategy. I agreed to provide investment and guidance, not to humiliate, but to ensure that the transition was handled smoothly and professionally. The result was subtle yet powerful. With my support, the company underwent restructuring, efficiencies were implemented, and projects that had once faltered under his leadership began to stabilize. My father was forced to recognize, silently if not publicly, that the person he had fired for incompetence was now a pivotal figure in saving and guiding the company. I felt no triumph, no gloating, only a calm satisfaction in knowing that patient, thoughtful action had reshaped the course of events without confrontation or drama. That evening, as I looked out over the city, the lights reflecting on wet streets, I reflected on the journey from humiliation to subtle, undeniable influence. I understood that real victory is not loud. It is built over years through patience, competence, and integrity. The boy once dismissed for incompetence had become a man capable of transforming not only his own destiny, but also influencing the path of a legacy that had once seemed untouchable. And in that quiet reflection, I realized the ultimate lesson. When preparation meets patience, when humility meets skill, and when consistency meets opportunity, even the most entrenched authority can be challenged, reshaped, and redirected, not through anger, not through revenge, but through quiet, persistent competence. The stage was set for the final resolution, where the culmination of years of effort, strategy, and self-belief would redefine both our futures, leaving behind lessons far more meaningful than any momentary satisfaction or fleeting victory. By the 8th year, the transformation was complete. Our company had become a major player in the industry, respected for its reliability, efficiency, and integrity. What had started as quiet growth, careful client management, and patient strategy had now translated into undeniable influence. I remember walking into the office one morning, the sunlight filtering softly through the windows, and realizing that the people who had once doubted me, the same clients, colleagues, and even my father, were now looking to us for guidance. It was surreal, yet calm, like a slow river reaching its destination. The pivotal moment came when a high-level industry conference announced its annual awards. For years, my father's company had dominated recognition, but this year, our firm received accolades for excellence in client management, innovation, and reliability. I accepted the awards quietly, knowing that the true victory was not in trophies, but in the quiet, consistent competence that had built a company capable of outperforming the long-established leader. My father noticed. At first, he tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as luck, but the subtle shift in industry perception could not be ignored. He reached out privately, not with anger, but with questions, curiosity, and I realized a begrudging acknowledgement of my capabilities. One afternoon, a turning point arrived. A meeting was called by his senior managers, proposing a major restructuring of his company. They were concerned about declining clients, slow adaptation, and a growing preference for our company among influential clients. I was asked to join as a consultant and investor to provide guidance for stability and growth. I accepted, carefully, strategically, and with clarity of purpose. This was the moment where years of preparation, quiet effort, and patient strategy converged. My involvement brought immediate improvement. Projects were stabilized, communication improved, and clients who had been frustrated returned with cautious optimism. I could see the subtle change in my father. Pride restrained by humility, authority softened by the undeniable reality that his son, once dismissed for incompetence, had become the guiding force ensuring the company's survival. I never flaunted this fact. I acted with calm professionalism, emphasizing competence, process, and solutions rather than past grievances. And yet, the impact was profound. Over the following months, my father began stepping back from daily operations. He realized quietly that the company's future was stronger under the structure, discipline, and vision I had cultivated. One rainy evening, I visited him in his office. He looked older, weary yet reflective. For the first time, he spoke without pride, without criticism. "I underestimated you," he said softly. I nodded, acknowledging his words, but I did not respond with triumph. Instead, I spoke about the journey, about the lessons learned from both failure and perseverance, about how the years of careful effort had reshaped the company not for revenge, but for sustainability. He listened quietly, and in that moment, I realized that the story was not about humiliation or triumph. It was about growth, understanding, and transformation. Slowly, he announced his retirement. It was not dramatic. There were no public confrontations or accusations. Instead, it was a quiet, thoughtful decision, motivated by the realization that the company needed steady, competent guidance, and that the person he had once dismissed was now capable of leading it into the future. I felt a calm satisfaction, rooted not in revenge, but in the recognition of persistence, competence, and patient effort. The board members formally handed over operations to me, acknowledging my leadership and the stability I had brought. Employees, clients, and colleagues all recognized the transformation, though few knew the full story behind it. Looking back, I understood that the years of being dismissed, humiliated, and underestimated had been the crucible that shaped me. Each late night, every careful decision, every moment of quiet effort had built a foundation strong enough to withstand challenge, competition, and skepticism. In the weeks following the transition, I focused on continuity, strengthening internal processes, mentoring employees, and ensuring that the company's growth remained steady. I reflected often on the irony. The very man who had once fired me for incompetence had now entrusted me with the legacy of the company, but there was no bitterness. Only reflection, gratitude, and a profound understanding of the lessons embedded in the journey. One evening, sitting in my office overlooking the city lights reflecting on wet streets, I realized the truth. Success is quiet, cumulative, and patient. Humiliation can be transformed into discipline, rejection into motivation, and underestimation into an advantage. The boy once dismissed had become a man capable of shaping not only his own destiny, but also influencing the path of a company that had once seemed untouchable. And in that quiet realization, I understood the subtle power of strategy and patience over pride and impulsiveness. In the months that followed, I began implementing innovative strategies for growth, expanding into new markets, and fostering a company culture that valued skill, transparency, and respect. Employees thrived, clients returned, and the company's reputation solidified. I often reflected on the long journey, from the humiliation of being fired, the careful years of preparation, to the moment where influence and competence became undeniable. And I knew that the ultimate lesson was this: quiet persistence, strategic patience, and consistent integrity achieve results that anger, pride, and confrontation cannot. One evening, as rain softly tapped against the window, I found myself smiling quietly. The boy who had been dismissed for incompetence had quietly rewritten his story, not through confrontation, not through shouting or revenge, but through calm, measured, and relentless effort. My father, now retired, occasionally visited, sharing memories, advice, and reflections. We spoke with mutual respect, understanding the journey that had brought us here. And though the past had been painful, the present was peaceful, meaningful, and satisfying. I realized that the true triumph was never about proving someone wrong. It was about proving to yourself that patience, skill, and perseverance can transform any setback into an opportunity for lasting impact. That night, as the city lights shimmered on wet streets and the rain faded into silence, I reflected on the journey with gratitude. The path had been long, quiet, and challenging, but it had led to a moment of undeniable growth, personal fulfillment, and the subtle, ultimate triumph that comes not from vengeance, but from the power of quiet competence and unwavering determination. By the 9th year, the transformation was complete, not just for the company, but for me personally. Looking back, I could see every step that had led to this moment: the humiliation of being fired, the quiet nights spent planning, the small victories that gradually built momentum, and the patience that allowed me to grow without rushing or reacting impulsively. The boy once dismissed for incompetence had become a man who quietly commanded respect, not through force, but through competence, consistency, and integrity. My father, now retired, occasionally visited, not to oversee but to reflect. Our conversations were calm, thoughtful, and respectful. For the first time, we could discuss business, life, and strategy without the shadows of past misunderstandings or hurt. One afternoon, he sat across from me in the office, the soft sunlight falling through the window, and said simply, "I never understood before, but I see now what you built. You've done more than I imagined possible." I smiled quietly, feeling warmth and closure rather than pride or triumph. It was a moment of mutual recognition, a gentle acknowledgement that years of hardship, patience, and careful effort had brought us to a new equilibrium. Over the following months, I focused on sustaining growth, nurturing the team, and maintaining the company culture that had become the foundation of our success. Employees thrived in an environment built on respect, collaboration, and skill, and clients continued to rely on us for guidance, trust, and results. I often reflected on the subtle lessons learned through the years. Humiliation had been painful, but it had taught resilience. Dismissal had been crushing, but it had inspired innovation and careful planning. Every challenge had been a teacher, shaping my ability to act with patience, clarity, and quiet strength. One day, an opportunity arrived to expand into a new market. I gathered the team, shared the vision, and meticulously planned every detail. Execution was precise, and the expansion succeeded beyond expectations. I realized then that success is not about reacting to others' doubts, but about consistently building your own foundation, step by step. My father observed from the sidelines, sometimes offering advice, but mostly allowing the company to operate independently under my guidance. I could see his pride, restrained by humility, and I felt a calm sense of fulfillment knowing that the lessons of patience, resilience, and competence had come full circle. Occasionally, I reflected on the irony of it all. The man who had fired me for incompetence had inadvertently created the conditions for my greatest growth. Without his dismissal, I might never have built the skills, patience, or strategic mindset that became the foundation of my success. And though there was a part of me that had once wanted to prove him wrong, I realized that the ultimate achievement was not revenge, but the quiet, lasting transformation of both my life and the company. One rainy evening, as I sat alone in the office reviewing plans for the coming year, I thought about the journey from humiliation to influence. Every setback, every moment of doubt, every small victory had been a step along the path that led here. I understood now that true success is not loud or immediate. It is the cumulative result of consistent, deliberate, and thoughtful effort. It is the quiet strength that grows in patience, the subtle confidence that emerges from skill, and the calm satisfaction that comes from integrity. And then came the final, subtle twist that tied everything together. The company, once rivaling my father's, had become not only a leader in the industry, but also a force of innovation and inspiration. Several of his former colleagues approached me, not for confrontation, but for mentorship and guidance, recognizing the value of the systems, culture, and principles we had built. I welcomed them, understanding that the cycle of growth and influence was now broader than personal rivalry. My father, watching quietly, expressed his approval in a way words could not fully convey. The past grievances, the humiliation, the pain, all had been transformed into lessons, growth, and a lasting legacy. And in that quiet understanding, I felt peace. One night, after the office had emptied and the city lights reflected softly on wet streets, I reflected on everything that had happened. I realized that the journey was never about proving someone else wrong. It was about proving to myself that patience, resilience, and integrity could overcome doubt, dismissal, and humiliation. That true influence is quiet, cumulative, and enduring. That skill and careful strategy outweigh arrogance and impulsiveness. That setbacks are not the end, but the beginning of preparation for something greater. I understood that the ultimate triumph is not in public recognition or dramatic victory, but in the steady, persistent work that quietly shapes outcomes and transforms lives. Looking back, I saw the path clearly. Humiliation had sparked motivation, dismissal had taught strategy, challenges had built resilience, and patience had created opportunity. Every moment, every decision, every step of careful action had led to the quiet, undeniable success that now surrounded me. And the most profound lesson of all emerged. The boy once dismissed as incompetent had grown into a man capable not only of building a successful company, but of transforming adversity into opportunity, weakness into strength, and doubt into clarity. My father's retirement, once a source of tension in my mind, became a symbol of closure, understanding, and reconciliation. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no lingering resentment, only the calm satisfaction of having navigated life's challenges with patience, skill, and integrity. And in that calm, reflective moment, I whispered to myself the lesson that had carried me through. Life is not about immediate recognition, revenge, or public validation. It is about consistent effort, patient strategy, humility, and integrity. Those who rise quietly, steadily, and thoughtfully often achieve the most enduring and meaningful success. As rain fell gently against the office window, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the journey from humiliation to influence, from dismissal to leadership was complete. The story was no longer about proving someone wrong. It was about living a life of purpose, resilience, and quiet strength. The boy once considered incompetent had become a man capable of shaping his own destiny, influencing others positively and building a lasting legacy. And as the city settled into night, I knew that this was the true triumph, not loud or flashy, but enduring, meaningful, and quietly powerful.